motion.
We have main engine
We
start.
had concern about ice in the launch area. It was delayed for an hour. But according to a very, very preliminary report from NASA, everything was fine right at liftoff. We've gone through the first few seconds after liftoff. Everything appears to be normal. I have viewed about 20 of these liftoffs in the past. There appeared to be nothing out of the ordinary. And it was not until we get almost a minute 10 into the flight when you see the first indication of trouble. And on the radio and on the report from NASA, they indicated they've had no difficulty at all reported from the shuttle, and none of their gauges indicated any difficulty either. It is now going out over the ocean. It is several miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center, about 4 miles at this point. And once we get to about a minute 10, we get to a different shot. They're at maximum thrust. They come up. This is the time that is most vulnerable for the shuttle. And we should look at the bottom section of the shuttle where you see what appear to be almost a fog or fumes or vapors. And that occurs about a second before. Watch closely. A second before you have the fireball and the major explosion. The major explosion was the main fuel tank exploding. It appears from everything we have been able to see that the solid rocket boosters, now you can see right there at the bottom of your picture, you see on both sides what appeared to be fumes or possibly a fire. You now see the explosion right at the base of, well, right next to where the astronauts are in the shuttle itself, at the point where the orbiter is connected to the main fuel tank. And that was the fireball. The astronauts have said that the launch itself is just like a fireball because you're being propelled with all of this highly volatile liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen into orbit. And at a period where the explosion took place, at the time of the explosion, they were at maximum thrust. In other words, as you can see, a solid rocket booster, which is falling off to the right of the picture. There is some concern, and some people at NASA have indicated they're looking very closely at those two solid rocket boosters, that and the main fuel engine. Those are the areas that very early, and we must repeat, very early indications are that there was some type of problem. It appeared from everything that those who have been viewing the tapes that there was some type of leak. We do not know why. There has been no indication and no official word from NASA yet as to what could have caused that. The speculation centers around two things. One, on the solid rocket booster, somehow there was a hole. Somehow a hole on the solid rocket booster created a release, and that then created the fire which caused the explosion. The second theory is that a seam right next to the shuttle itself, right at the point where the shuttle is attached to the main fuel tank, that there may have been a rupture for some very unknown reason, and at that point there was an immediate explosion.
Bruce?
But it is still very early, Dan.
I was just going to say, Bruce, the one thing we want to emphasize as we go through with our coverage, it is still very early on. NASA was, to say the least, taken aback, horrified, of course, but taken aback because so far as could be immediately determined, there was no indication of trouble aboard the spaceship. When Bruce Hall says that the area of early question centers on the solid rocket boosters, this is what he's talking about, these two solid rocket boosters that go along the sides of the space shuttle. As you saw in the slow motion pictures, there seemed to be a indication of some flaming up in this area of these solid rocket boosters, which are designed to fall away from the spacecraft. Down on the lower left-hand solid rocket booster is one suspicious area. Just before the major explosion, two suspicious-looking what could have been vapor flame-ups there. Now, these solid rocket boosters have fuel that's the texture of sort of rubber, and it is true that you can beat on it with a sledgehammer and not ignite it or make it explode. However, it can put off and does put off some vapors, and one question is, did vapors from this solid rocket booster somehow get out in here and cause ignite and then cause the major explosion with the liquid fuel that's in the larger tank. These are solid fuel rockets. This is the liquid tank from which the space shuttle or orbiter itself, with its 3 engines at the base, takes its fuel from here. Now, the whole thing was still together about a minute and 12 seconds into the launch when the explosion occurred. And what Bruce was talking about right down in here on this left-hand solid booster rocket is one suspicious area. Now, no one can say with any certainty that that's the area in which it all started. From the slow-motion videotape, it is a suspicious area. Of course, when you're carrying 500,000 pounds of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen in this main tank, the seams that hold that main tank together are another area of question mark and another area of suspicion. Clearly, once the major explosion, once the ball of flame that you saw did include the main tank, but question, did it start in the solid rocket fuel boosters and that ignited the main tank, or was the original problem with the highly volatile liquid hydrogen in the main tank? When we talk about the orbiters, when they name these Space Shuttle Columbia, Space Shuttle Challenger, and so on, they're talking about just the orbiter. And just this part is all that actually goes out into space. First, the solid rocket boosters fall off, then the liquid tank, after it's done its job, falls off, and the space shuttle with its engines right in the rear goes on out into space and goes into orbit. Space Shuttle Challenger had done that 10 times. Well, today was to have been the 10th time, and today it went up in flames. Aboard the Space Shuttle today, and presumed killed in that fireball, were the commander, Major Francis Dick Scobie, 46 years old, from Auburn, Washington, married, 2 children, second mission, his first command of a shuttle mission, retired major from the Air Force. His pilot, second in command, Mike Smith, 40 years old, from Beaufort, North Carolina, married, 3 children. His first mission, he was a commander in the United States Navy, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Also aboard today, mission specialist Judith Resnick, 36 years old, from Akron, Ohio, doctorate in electrical engineering. Her second mission, trained to operate the shuttle's robot arm. Ronald Michener, mission specialist, 35 years old, from Lake City, South Carolina, married, 2 children, doctorate in physics from MIT. This was his second flight. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, 39 years old, from Hawaii, married, 2 children, Air Force colonel. This was his second flight. Greg Jarvis, payload specialist from Hughes Aircraft, 41 years old, an electrical engineer. His job was to conduct experiments on how liquids behave in the weightlessness of space. And Susan Krista McAuliffe, 37-year-old social studies teacher from New Hampshire, and the mother of 2. Veteran test pilot Chuck Yeager, the man who originally broke the sound barrier, the first man to break the sound barrier, talked about the dangers of flight.
Not as dangerous? Or?
Well, it takes an accident like this to generate comments that you hear now about, you know, safety and things like this, as it occurred in the Stretch DC-8 accident in Gander. You know, it generated a big flap about air safety, and this will generate a flap about safety in space. And we've gone through this before in the Apollo fire that killed Gus Grissom and Ed White and another astronaut. But the point is, you have accidents when you're fooling around. You have accidents in automobiles and accidents around the house, but you've got to expect them, obviously. And one thing that this will bring about, I'm quite sure, is a tightening up of the systems. And whether or not it merits a tightening up of the system, that's what will come out of the accident investigation.
Chuck Yeager, the original American pilot of The Right Stuff, talking today about the dangers of flight. A catastrophic explosion blew apart the Space Shuttle Challenger, apparently sending schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe and 6 NASA astronauts to the fiery death in the sky some 8 miles out from the Kennedy Space Center. Never before in 56 manned space flights had Americans died in flight. 3 died on the launch pad in 1967, but that was on the launch pad as part of the Apollo program. So far as can be determined, we know that at least 4 Soviet cosmonauts have died in space accidents. 1 was reported in 1967, and 3 in 1971. But the Soviet program, which is primarily in the hands of the military and is a closed, not open to coverage program, it's always difficult to ascertain with any accuracy about what has not happened to the Soviets in space. Congressman Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, also talked about today's tragedy.
Space shuttle carried on its side the flag of the United States, and those who served on her served us, the American people. They served our hopes for scientific exploration and for human progress. But they also served our dreams because they lived at the frontier of what mankind can achieve together.
Tip O'Neill, speaking of the frontiers of space, the high frontier. The explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger followed an apparently flawless launch. It had been delayed for 2 hours because, among other things, of cold weather. Icicles were all over the space shuttle and its apparatus, but NASA waited 2 hours, delayed 2 hours, and felt confident as the icicles melted away that the weather, although it was about 28 degrees, unusually cold for this part of Florida this morning, although it had been that cold, NASA felt after a 2-hour delay it could make the launch and make it successfully. The tragedy defies any easy explanation. You've heard, as part of our CBS News live coverage today, all kinds of theories, an hypothesis here and
one of the things we were talking about before is once these guys get up there and on orbit, they've got a very strange working day. It's a little bit different from what it's been in the past.
Well, today they're going to take it easy. The only strange part about it is when they go to sleep and when they get up. They will get about 8 hours of sleep every night, but that will start tonight, for example, at 7:30 our time, having them get up about 3:30 in the morning.
And that changes all week until it's earlier and earlier, right?
We gradually move the wake-up time a little bit earlier so that on the landing day they have enough time to get up and get all the things done that they need to do before they deorbit to land at Edwards at 9 o'clock Pacific time.
So those of us who are following it on mission control, if we're on astronaut time, we're getting up at 12, 1, 2, 3 in the morning and going to bed around dinner time.
That's right. We're more tired than they are.
The landing also, if they don't get their crosswind, it will be the first concrete runway landing. Is that correct?
At the present time, that is the plan.
While they're on orbit, we were talking before, one of the things you have studied has been the ARM, the remote manipulator system. What are they going to be doing different with the ARM this time when they're up there?
Well, once again, we're going to be picking up a small instrumentation package that will measure the contamination around the orbiter, and this package is housed towards the back part of the orbiter. We are not going to actually let go of the monitor. We're just going to move it around in a pre-programmed sequence to measure the atmosphere that the orbiter puts out as it moves through the orbit. On later flights, the remote manipulator arm will be used to take large satellites, for example, out of the cargo bay and put them into orbit. The orbiter will act much like a bus at that time, and the satellite will be actually getting off at its bus stop, so to speak. We get to the right place in the right time, and we'll pick it up with the arm, and we'll put it where we want to, let go, and then back the orbiter away and leave it there.
That's really the kind of routine use of the space shuttle that we've been talking about all along, at least that NASA has. Judy, thank you. We will be coming back for lots more conversations with you. And Frank, I believe we're coming up with the first acquisition of signal from the astronauts as they approach orbit.
Well, there's a bit of history for you, among other things. Lynn Sherr, who's covered space for us since 1980, and the anchorman she was talking to then was Frank Reynolds, our most distinguished predecessor here at ABC News, who had a deep and abiding passion about space and who used to run off to Cape Kennedy at every single opportunity just to watch a mission. Lynn, Judy Resnick was one of 7 or 8 women in the program?
Yeah, more, Peter. That first group was the small group, and they were really the pioneers. They were the ones who had to prove to the world, but most importantly to NASA. I think the world was ready for them before NASA was. That, in fact, women could be astronauts, and what a wonderful job they have done. Watching that tape, very sad to remember that and watch that. But at that time, Judy did not have a flight scheduled. As you remember, of course, it was very competitive for all the new astronauts, all the old astronauts too, and particularly among the women, who was going to get the first flight. Sally Ride was named to the first flight for an American woman astronaut, and Judy got the next one. And part of what she was doing was being on very good behavior and doing her job very well, but she really wanted a mission. When she finally got her mission, of course, she was absolutely delighted, but listen to what she said. She said the orbiter at this point is behaving just like a bus. It's going to drop the satellite off at its bus station. That was in 1982, and she was prepared to think of shuttle flight as routine bus travel, if you will. Now, I know she knew perfectly well it was a lot riskier than that and a lot more complicated than that, but that's the terms in which she was thinking, and I think all the astronauts. And I think the women are no different from the men in terms of getting used to it, taking the risk in stride, being perfectly aware of what they were doing, but giving it their all anyway. It's sad to see that.
I may be getting an obvious answer, seeking an obvious answer here, but why do women have so much trouble convincing NASA that they were able to fly?
Well, because the space agency originally began thinking that they needed, saying that they needed military pilots to fly their spacecraft. As we talked about earlier, in fact, these early spacecraft, there really wasn't a lot of flying to be done, but it seemed as if that was the way they were going to do it, and that allowed them to dip into their Air Force and Naval and Marine pilots and into that corps and say, we're going to pick the best and the brightest from that group. And women were systematically excluded
Lynn?
Because, of course, women are not in combat. Yes, Peter?
This is the NASA news conference we've all been waiting for. This is Hugh Harris, who is normally the voice of launch control, and we cannot hear him. So I cannot tell you what they are saying, but we have waited 4 hours and 15 minutes to hear them, and we do not have audio from Cape Canaveral. We will monitor this absolutely as closely as we can. That is James Moore, who is the associate administrator for the shuttle program. Somebody please find the audio. Well, we'll tell you about it, I promise. Jesse Moore, as I said, is the associate administrator, and with him is the voice of launch control. One of the great anticlimaxes of all time here, because we've been waiting for 4 hours, almost coming up on 5 hours, to hear him and Hugh Harris. And I can assure you that somewhere between here and the Cape, everybody is doing every imaginable thing possible to find out what has gone wrong.
Early indications
there it
in
is.
the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area, approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you. Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever. Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WGIR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impact. Okay, Else Selstead from Baltimore Sun in the first row.
Mr. Moore, at this time, do you have any estimate of how much liquid fuel was in the external tank at the time of the explosion, and how much explosive power, say in terms of TNT, that remaining liquid fuel might have been equal to?
No, sir, not at this time. You realize what we've been doing since 11:40 this morning is we immediately pulled our senior management together in this program, and I formed an interim board to ensure that all relevant data to this event would be impounded and would be made accessible to the investigative people that will go and take a look at it. I can't answer your specific questions relative to how much fuel was on board at this point in time. The board, when it's formally reported by the administrator, formally formed by the acting administrator, I'm sure will go into those kinds of questions, but I can't answer it right now. Okay, we're going to take one more question here before going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Here in the right opposite you, Jackie.
Peter Van Sant from CBS News. We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with any of with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, a heater box that had about a quarter of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time. Wait for the microphone. I have to have the microphone.
There was no damage to any tank, or this arm did not strike any tank as far as
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, we're going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Just a couple of questions.
This is the Johnson Space Center. We have a question from Paul Reeser, Associated Press.
Yes, Mr. Moore. Was there any debris of any description recovered by the vessels, and if so, what was it?
We do not have any detailed debris reports at this point in time. That certainly is something that we're looking at, and we will be impounding all the debris that we recover, and we've set up plans here to store that debris so that the investigating group can go in and look at that and assess that in great detail. I do not have any detailed reports right now on debris.
Okay. Bruce Nichols.
Mr. Moore, with all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there, and who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintain that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We're going to the Marshall Space Flight Center for a couple of questions.
Martin Berkey with Huntsville Times. Can you tell me what this does to the schedule on down the line, and including the launch at Vandenberg?
No, I'm not prepared to do that. What I have done is basically suspend operations for a few days till we can sit down and assess this. And, you know, we're obviously not going to pick up any flight activity until we fully understand what the circumstances were relative to this morning's launch. So in the interim, near-term time, we basically suspended operations until we get a handle on what our problems were this morning.
Nick Miller, WAFF Television in Huntsville. What part will Marshall Space Flight Center play in the investigation, since the propulsion system was the responsibility of the Space Flight Center here?
Well, they obviously have to play a very strong role in the investigating what happened this morning. As you know, the Space Shuttle program is built around a team effort, not only involving the Marshall Center, but also the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. All of the elements have different responsibilities, and clearly Marshall has the propulsive responsibilities on the shuttle. They will play a very dominant role, as will the other three centers I mentioned, as well as anybody that is contributing to the overall program and has some relevant information to add will certainly play a part.
Okay, we're moving to Washington for questions from NASA headquarters. Okay, there is a problem with our audio circuits to Washington. We are going to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the appointment of this interim review board and said that it would be making statements from time to time. Not to put any adverse interpretations on this, it sounds a little bit like a news blackout, and I'm wondering if your objective is to consolidate information, what will be the point of issue of all those announcements in the future? And are other people not involved in that review board forbidden to talk?
Well, let me correct your statement. First of all, I said that I had appointed an interim review board. That interim review board is composed of the senior members of the NASA team here to take immediate actions on impounding data. The acting administrator is expected to appoint a formal review board very shortly, and it will be left up to that review board in order to determine its progress reports in terms of their findings. What we have done here today is to move very quickly so that all relevant data could be impounded, and all actions that are needed to be taken in order to preserve as much information as we can on the circumstances of this morning can be preserved. And that's the nature of the work that I've implemented today, and I expect a formal board to be established very, very shortly, within the next day or so, by the acting administrator.
This is Roy Neal, NBC News. Jess, you've said, I believe, that future flights are temporarily frozen. The United States space program, as a result, is at a halt. Now, based on your experience, how long would you estimate that this investigation will take? 6 months, a year, before you get back in business?
Roy, it is, as you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can, but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
One more question from JPL.
Bill Hines again. I've got to follow up on that first question of mine. I understand now that there will be announcements made after the permanent board is appointed. Is that correct?
There will be an announcement, I'm sure, of the members of the permanent board, yes. I believe that will be correct, and then I think that board will determine its rate of reporting based on the progress of its findings.
Okay, we're going next to the Washington NASA headquarters.
Are there any indications of sabotage or attack on the shuttle?
I'm sorry, we didn't read that question. And while they're repairing that circuit to Washington, we'll go to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland.
Mark Weaver, WBAL Radio in Baltimore. Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Ken Terrell from WDVM in Washington. Were there any unusual weather conditions aloft or any unusual weather conditions during the launch?
None that we observed that I recall. We did put up some weather balloons early this morning. We did look at load conditions as we normally do, and the winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge, and we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Mr. Moore, I.J. Hudson from WRC-TV. Has it become a problem that you have been too good in the past, that the American people have seen flawlessly perform missions on TV almost routinely, and that something like this happens all of a sudden, it hits home even harder?
Well, I don't know how to answer your question specifically. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our #1 priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impacts from that to determine where we go in the future.
I think you can hear it over the speaker.
Okay, back here at the Kennedy Space Center, we only have time for a couple more questions. Jay Barbary from NBC News in the front row here.
Jess, I would like to know if you know what happened to Challenger. Can we assume that it was consumed in the explosion? And can you tell us specifically what you know now that the recovery crew has recovered in the impact area?
I have not gotten a briefing, Jay, on what the recovery team has found at this point in time. And I have basically looked at the NASA Select photos and so forth that you did, and all I can say is that it appeared from those photos that there was an explosion. And that's about all I can say at this point in time.
Okay, we have time for only one more question, and James Fisher from the Orlando Sentinel has had his hand up a long time.
Jess, I realize this is a rather forward-thinking question, but what is the situation with the Rockwell plant about the possibility for ordering another shuttle? Has the assembly line been shut down? What's the situation with that?
Well, as we've discussed in the past, we are manufacturing structural spares for an orbiter system, and that manufacturing process is continuing. We are also buying spares for the current fleet that we have, and there is a production capability there if and when it's decided that that's the next step we want to do, is to move forward and do that. So I think the bottom line answer to your question is yes, that is a possibility, that we could implement a production capability for another orbiter if that were decided to be the thing to do.
Okay, I'm sorry to have to wind this up now. Mr. Moore has to get back immediately. As you know, he's been here since very early in the morning, and there's much to be done. Thank you all. Thank you.
Well, you may well feel the same sense of frustration that we do. They don't know anything yet, or at least they don't know anything they're going to tell us. That was Jesse Moore, who is the Associate Administrator of NASA, for whom we have been waiting for some hours, and perhaps the long wait created a heightened sense of anticipation about having at least some indication. You probably noticed at the end there, one of the reporters asked whether or not we could assume that in that enormous explosion which occurred a little more than 2 minutes after liftoff, that the shuttle itself had been consumed in the flames, and Jesse Moore simply would not speculate on that. There is going to be an interim review board, and then subsequently there's going to be a formal review board. And all the suggestion is there at the moment that we are in for a very long period of NASA investigation as to what actually did go on. I said it may be the lengthy wait we have had for some word on what happened to the Challenger itself, because the fate of the 7 astronauts on board has been clear for some time now, even as the search goes on in the Atlantic Ocean out about 18 miles off the Cape. And the flag at half-mast, half-staff at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral says it all. 7 American lives lost, and no answers yet as to what anything they know at all. Let me just, before we talk to Gene Cernan, who has been tremendously helpful to us on this day, just a couple of other things here. They do not know, so says Jesse Moore, how long the American space program will be brought to a halt, but he does say quite simply, until we feel it is safe to fly again. And the national interest in this is surely reflected by the number of centers, all of which are space centers around the country, Maryland, California, Washington, Texas, and Florida itself, where reporters have gathered in the hope that we would know almost 6 hours after this accident something that would happen. Gene Cernan, who is in Houston, Texas today near the Johnson Space Center. Gene, do you get anything out of that briefing at all from Jesse Moore?
Well, Peter, I think Jess was as candid with us as he could possibly be. We talked earlier this afternoon. I'm not sure anybody really knows more than we already know at this point in time. There's a tremendous amount of data to gather, as he said, and they've got to assess what that data means, see if they can find a problem, and eventually correct it. And that indeed could be a very long time. I think experiences showed us after the Apollo 1 fire, it took us a lot longer than we'd anticipated before we could get back in gear.
One of the things that Jess Moore did say was that he was very aware that we had all been showing the footage again of the explosion, which of course is provided by the space agency, and he will not speculate on any of that. Is he trying to tell us, do you think, that we don't learn anything from that picture?
Oh no, I think they're going to learn a great deal from those films, and I think they're going to go over those over and over and over again, and I think they, along with a lot of the digital or telemetry data and any other pieces that they can retrieve from the ocean, are going to all play a great part in assessing the problem. I really honestly believe that he just can't afford to speculate at this time because he doesn't know any more than he's really told us. I'm not trying to defend NASA's position. I don't think it's a position of secrecy or trying to impound information. I think they're trying to impound as much data as they can so that they don't lose something that might be significantly important to the analysis of this tragedy.
Gene, you indeed, in fact, on previous occasions have been quite critical of some things the space agency has been doing, but I think I know where your heart is. So let me ask you, having said that, the following. Almost everywhere we've gone today, there's been the suggestion from somebody, and maybe it's just the suggestion for the sake of it, that the space agency was under pressure to get going, to get these flights off the ground, to get competitive in space, to get the payloads up in space, to serve all the customers. What's your own view of that?
Well, I think they were under pressure to respond to the commercial hype that is growing over the last number of years, to respond to the commercial competition of the European community and others. But the one thing that, if I've been critical of anything, was their unswerving dedication to the fact that they're not going to go anywhere until they're ready. There's nothing I could ever criticize about NASA's safety record or their approach to safety, or the fact that they found some little nitpicking problems because of that approach to safety. There's no way I could criticize that other than to say maybe that kept them from going when they could have, when they didn't, when they made decisions not to go because I thought they were too conservative.
No.
I really don't believe that the commercial pressure, if anything, there wasn't enough commercial culture within NASA to understand the need to go on a commercial competitively basis, which today tells me that they probably did everything they possibly could to ensure the safety of this flight, just like they have in the past.
Just before I ask you one more question, Gene, I want to remind our audience that, in fact, we are waiting for President Reagan, who is going to have some words for the nation clearly of comfort. In about 7 minutes from now, he says he's going to come to the White House briefing room probably and talk to the nation for about 5 minutes at about 5 o'clock Eastern Time, which is about 7 minutes from now. Jean and Lynn, Sherr, I'd like you both perhaps to get involved in this. A couple of questions today, as we've also heard throughout the last 5 or 6 hours, about the weather. Whether or not the weather might have had an effect. Listening to Jess Moore today, Jean, and then you, Lynn, can we rule out the weather as a problem? Jean?
I'm sorry, Peter, you were cut out there for a moment.
I'm sorry. I'm asking you whether or not, in short, we can rule out the weather as a problem based on what Jess Moore said in that briefing a while ago.
Well, I'd like to rule out the weather, but I don't think you can rule out anything at this point in time. We had a lot of ice on the pad. Who is to say or not to say that maybe some of that ice in some way didn't have some effect? I can't speculate that it did. But, you know, if I were on that team, I would not rule out any possibility of any kind at this point in time, particularly within 5 or 6 hours of the occurrence of the tragedy.
Lynn?
Yeah, Peter, the one question that Jess Moore did answer definitely no was he was asked if he had seen, if they knew of any weather problems during ascent. And I think the clear implication was some kind of lightning or something like that. What he said was no, there was no evidence of that whatsoever. Jean and I sat in the booth during the nighttime launch of the 8th mission and watched terrible jagged edges of lightning dance around the shuttle on the pad. Very, very frightening. That is not a good thing for the shuttle. This does not appear to have happened. There doesn't appear to have been something, but I agree with Jean totally. There's absolutely nothing that can be ruled out. And of course, Jess Moore didn't really deal with the issue of the cold and the frost. They have got to take a very, very hard look at that.
Just before I go on with both of you, as the audience knows, when we were trying to get Jess Moore the first time, the Associate Administrator of NASA, who gave that briefing at Cape Canaveral, we had, as did NASA, some technical problems with our audio. What he said was, I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary search of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, the searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. That's what he said, probably stating the obvious, as the flag flying at half-mast at Cape Canaveral suggests to us. And the ocean at that particular point is about 100 to 200 feet deep. We do not know, or at least Mr. Moore will not tell us at the moment, whether or not Challenger stayed on the surface, whether it landed in pieces, whether it went to the bottom of the ocean at that particular time.
Peter?
Yes, Lynn?
Peter, I think we really ought to point out that while what Jean said is certainly true, I think Jess Moore was being as candid as he felt he could be. I think we have to appreciate that while I am not accusing him of misspeaking, clearly he probably knows more things than he's able to tell us now because he hasn't been able to put them all together. I think that he says he hasn't been briefed about the recovery team, what they have found. Obviously, bits and pieces are leaking out all over the place, and he knows some of it, but he doesn't know it all. And I think it is extremely wise of him, as a matter of fact, not to be giving out little bits of information until they have figured out all the information. For instance, he answered one question. He said he did not know how much fuel was left in the tank. Somebody at NASA right now knows exactly how much fuel was left in that tank because it says so on a screen somewhere. Either that information has not gotten to Jess Moore, or he feels that he wants to wait until they can weave a whole story together and give us a bigger picture rather than little fragments one at a time, which I think makes a certain amount of sense, as frustrating as it is to us.
In fact, we almost know how much fuel there was in that tank, don't we? Don't those normally hold about 500,000 gallons?
That's on liftoff, and if you can do the arithmetic and you can figure out what happens after 95 seconds, then you can work it out, and we have been working on working it out ourselves. So sure, that's dealable with.
We don't know. Sorry, Jean, please.
I was just going to say, and Peter, you've had a long day already. You've been on the air all day long, as most other people have been involved with what happened today. But everybody and their brother, those of us in the press and outside the press, are being pressed to speculate, and everyone is looking for a cause. I don't want to say a scapegoat, but a cause. What was it? An icicle? Was it a tank rupture? Did someone not do their job? Did a crane hit a tank and no one tell us about it? I think it's unfair at this point in time of all of us, in the press and out of it, to try and find or put a finger on anybody for the cause of this accident. It occurred. I think we've got to deal with it in a manner in which we can best prevent it from ever occurring again, pick up the pieces and learn something, if you will, as we hopefully do from all tragedies like this, and press on. It's not going to do any good, and Lynn and you and I have been close to this before, it's not going to do any good to try and find out who did what wrong at this point in time.
Well, I agree with that, Gene, and I think there's another point to be made, which is that Jess Moore is really the man in the hot seat right now. Not only is he still the acting associate administrator of NASA for space shuttle flights, but he, as you know, has just been appointed to head the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and he's going to hold on to both jobs for a while. There is nobody right now who is feeling the pressure more than he is, and he is the guy that is going to be responsible, and he is the one who will have to report to us when they get some information.
Well, thank you both very much, Lynn, for a very long day. You're not finished, I must tell you. And you, Gene, particularly for saying what you did just a moment ago, because I'm well aware that as the day goes on, though we tend to, we do our best to stay away from speculation, we do tend to skirt it. And it is also true that I think as a nation we want answers in something more of a hurry than they can be provided. And surely the crash of the charter jet bringing home 250 American servicemen from the Sinai's a couple of months ago will remind us that the answers we seek in such a hurry are not always there. The reason for that crash of a DC-8, simple by comparison to the Space Shuttle Challenger, has still not been fully determined. And the Canadian Investigation Board, which is in charge, or the lead investigating team, continues to search for answers when all of the data at least was, excuse me, physically available. And so, yes, we indeed must restrain ourselves no matter how difficult it is. President Reagan is going to be speaking to the nation from the Oval Office in just about a minute from now. I should tell you that a short while after that, on World News Tonight, we will have a wrap-up of this day from around the country and from around the world. And then there will be an ABC News special tonight from 10 Eastern Time until 11 time. And after that, there will be a one-hour Nightline, which tells you something we don't need to tell you, the magnitude of this tragedy, both in terms of individuals, the 7 people who died on board Challenger this morning, and the setback to the very ambitious American space program. We now go to the White House and President Reagan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. The events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald Michener, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
Speaking from the Oval Office, President Reagan evoking the memories of Francis Drake, who lost his life on this day more than 3 centuries ago. And if you will forgive a personal observation, speaking with great eloquence to the school children, saying it's part of the process of exploration and discovery that the future belongs to the brave, not to the faint of heart. Not very long from now, on most of these stations around the country, World News Tonight, as I said earlier, on the impact of this tragedy, both at home and overseas, and then at 10 o'clock this evening, an hour special on the full ABC network on this day in January 1986, which we will so long remember, and then a full expanded hour of Nightline with Ted Koppel as we continue to comfort one another, I suppose, and examine this worst of tragedies in the American space program. Marked by the flag at Cape Canaveral in Florida, flying at half-staff in memory and in honor of the 7 members of the Challenger crew who lost their lives exploring the heavens on January the 28th, 1986.
The Shuttle, Disaster in Space, has been a presentation of ABC News.
A teacher since 1970 and was selected from 11,146 teachers from all across the country who had applied to be NASA's first citizen in space. The first strictly citizen in space. She was to have been married, her husband's an attorney, had 2 small children. She was to have taught later in the week 2 15-minute classroom lessons from space. Those, the 7 Americans who perished today aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in a ball of flame. In the California desert north of Los Angeles is the Rockwell International Facility where the Space Shuttle Challenger was put together. CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen has been there for reaction.
This is where the Challenger was built, Rockwell International in the Mojave Desert at Palmdale, California. Over the lunch hour today, the people who had put the Challenger together sat in stunned disbelief as they watched their spaceship on the videotape replays, exploding over and over again.
When the word started coming out, people were really down. Emotions were, few people around the plant crying. People just felt really bad because of something they built, and they really were happy to see it go and stuff. And when that came around, everybody was really down about it.
And I feel sorry for all the things that happened over there, and I'd like to tell the families and everybody else how sorry we are.
Crushed. It's very hard to understand that you work on something and have so much pride and know that it happened. And that there's nothing really you can do, but just the pride of knowing that you worked on it.
Sorrow, wounded pride, utter helplessness. The feelings of the space-age workers who helped the Challenger rise from the California desert. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
And now, as it happened, videotape from this morning's tragedy and explosion in space. This was the 56th manned space launch for the United States.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And the flaming debris got smaller and smaller as it rained for 45 minutes into the Atlantic Ocean just southeast of the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Now in slow motion videotape, the critical scenes just before and during the explosion as the orbiter shuttle rides on its own liquid fuel tank and with the solid booster rockets on the sides. The catastrophic explosion left Mission Control in Houston stunned. At a news conference this afternoon, the first official word from NASA since the disaster, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration said simply and directly it did not know what had happened. For CBS News in New York, Dan Rather with Bruce Hall, CBS News at Cape Canaveral, Florida. We'll have full coverage of what happened today and reaction to it on the CBS Evening News later. And shortly, coming up next, on many of these stations, your early local news. For now, good day.
It's not really so difficult physically. It's a lot of new things, but they lead you through it by the hand. This is a demonstration of
now, wait a minute. That doesn't look like a lot of fun for a Saturday afternoon to me. I don't know about you, but...
Well, you have to learn how to survive in case you have to get out of an airplane in a parachute, and they teach you step by step how to fall, how to be dragged. That's the impact you feel if you go through an ejection seat, and it's really not as bad as it looks. They show you how to fall into the water by, instead of letting you fall the first time, they let you slide down a slide wire. Like I say, they break you into it gradually.
Were you a tomboy when you were a kid?
No.
You weren't, and you took to this right away. You like it.
It's fun.
What's the best part about being an astronaut?
Everything.
You just like it all?
Yes.
You get to exercise your training, electrical engineering, and expand your knowledge enormously, I would think.
Yes, I think the best part technically is that it's a very well-rounded approach to science and technology, and we get to do a little bit of everything in state-of-the-art, and it's always a challenge.
What happens when you meet a man who's not in the space program and doesn't know who you are, and you say, I'm an astronaut? Does he say, yeah, you're too cute to be an astronaut. Come on, little lady, you can't be an astronaut.
I just tell him I'm an engineer.
You don't tell him you're an astronaut?
Not unless he asks.
You really, you mean when you meet people for the first time? What about the whole business about social relationships? Does it make it, are some men threatened by the fact that you're an astronaut?
I don't know. If they are, they're probably not my friends.
Yeah. Judy Resnick, she would have been 37 years old in April. She's a classically trained pianist from Akron, Ohio. She loved the space program more than I can describe for you here today, and really loved going up into space. I had an enthusiastic letter from her not too long ago. She was saying that she was hoping I could come down and watch this one because she was sure it was going to go off on schedule. We used to have a running dialogue about whether NASA could keep to its schedule or not. She was a absolutely wonderfully dedicated astronaut, and it's a great loss to her family and, of course, to the country as well. It just really is an example of the kind of people that you have in the astronaut program. They are so gifted in so many ways. A PhD in electrical engineering, she was an enthusiastic gardener, she was a classical pianist, and despite her protestations that she couldn't do things better than some of the men, all the men told me that when she operated that big Canadian arm at the back of the payload, she had a great touch, that she had real dexterity. It may have been a result of her piano training, but at any rate, it is a great loss for everybody. We have now a schematic that we can show you that we will superimpose, as it were, over some of the pictures that we saw earlier today. These are the actual pictures, and then the schematic, as you can see, lays over so you can get a better sense of what we're talking about. Could we put that back up there again? Okay, fine. Anyhow, we're watching it now begin to blow up, and as you can see, the shuttle itself was on the bottom. The two solid rocket boosters were on either side, and the external tank is what appeared to come apart, although it's, I must emphasize that Jess Moore from NASA, who knows a great deal more about this than I do, refused to speculate based on those pictures. He's looked on them, he's looked at them, he's listened to all of us as we have made our observations today that it appeared to be a problem with the external tank, and he refused to get into that speculation, as well as he should not get into it, because after all, we want the best kind of investigation to go forward. Bob Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California right now. Bob, what are they saying out there about the nature of the investigation?
Well, the nature of the investigation isn't something that's being conducted here. This is the headquarters for unmanned spaceflight. However, one of the things that was interesting here is that so many of us who cover space regularly were here because of the Uranus mission of the Voyager spacecraft. And even the most veteran, hardened, experienced space reporter, there was just such a state of shock here among people who had seen so many space launches one after another to see what had happened today. When you're talking about the external fuel tank, and we're just speculating here as we have been all day long, obviously, that was what exploded. Yeah. The question is whether it was the first thing to explode and whether it was the thing that initiated the explosion, and I guess that's the key question, because when we do look at those pictures, there's no question that that huge barrel of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, one of the most explosive combinations that human beings can put together, did go up and annihilate everything that had been left of the space shuttle. There's no question about that. The question is what initiated it. One of the things that will certainly be looked at in the investigation, and I'm not at all suggesting that this is what happened, but one of the things that will be examined in the investigation is that there are what NASA calls pyrotechnics. There are explosives on board the shuttle which are designed to blow it up. Now, there are hundreds of safety devices to keep those things from going off accidentally, but there is a man called the range safety officer whose duty it is to watch the shuttle, and in case it starts to go way off course and approach a populated area, he presses a button that would cause the shuttle to blow up. Now, those pyrotechnic devices are one of many, probably hundreds or even thousands of things that they're looking at as a possible malfunction. So, as Jess Moore said before, just from looking at that tape, all that you can see is that there was an explosion. You can't see what caused it, and it's probably going to take them an awful long time. One of the things that was interesting to me, having watched so many launches and looking at it, is that there wasn't a single indication of anything going wrong whatsoever. There was talk about the launch looking slow and everything, but if we've done earlier in the day, if you play it back next to normal launches, in fact, it wasn't slow. It has to do with camera angles. There was talks about funny noise, but that has to do with the wind condition. It was a cold day, so it would have sounded much different to anybody who was there than it would on a normal Florida humid afternoon. There was no indication whatsoever, because if there had been, they would have radioed it to the crew. There would have been some evidence of it in the conversation. The only thing there was the permission for Dick Scobie, the commander, to go ahead to full throttle, his acknowledgement of that command, and then apparently as he just was going to full throttle, there was the explosion. So it's going to take quite an investigation to find out. At this point, there are no clues whatsoever. Tom?
Thanks very much, Bob Bazell, who, as he indicated, he's watched a good many of those, and they are magnificent sights on takeoff. as they were today, as a matter of fact. In the original flight, I remember a man saying it's a real pant flapper. You have no sense of what it's like on takeoff, the sheer raw power of the space shuttle and its attached propellant systems until you're there and can feel it, as you actually can, as it sweeps across the Cape, the sound and the reverberations on takeoff. And it's a sight of utter majesty. And then today, that sight of utter majesty turned into a sight of utter horror. John Palmer's in New York now with additional information on this national tragedy, which has been going on now for almost 6 hours. John Palmer.
Yes, Tom, a national tragedy it is, a very sad day, and another sad statistic. A total of 11 children now have apparently lost at least one of their parents as the result of the explosion and the downing of the Space Shuttle Challenger, a catastrophic fire that blew apart the Space Shuttle just about a minute and a half after it took off. A few minutes ago, the Associate Director of NASA and the head of the Houston Space Center, in that very brief announcement and took a few questions down at the Cape, he said that the space program, had experienced a national tragedy, and he said there was no evidence the crew had survived. It's now after sundown in that search area, about 18 miles off the coast from Cape Canaveral. And as Jess Moore told us about 45 minutes ago, they have found no evidence, no debris, and certainly no sign of any survivors whatsoever. Jess Moore announced that he has formed an interim board to investigate, to review the facts right immediately, and to impound all information, all computer data, to get ready for another more formal board that will really look into the cause to see what happened. He said he would not speculate on the cause of the explosion because he said it was just too early, and as Tom just mentioned, he said that he was not going to speculate on the basis of those tragic pictures we see of about a minute and a half into the flight, the explosion there of the space shuttle. Again, he said...
Today's tragedy, the shuttle, a disaster in space. I'm Peter Jennings in Washington.
'Cause no one's quite the same.
Here in the nation's capital and across the country. And this is why. The picture is now etched in our minds, but still horrifying. The disastrous end of the 25th shuttle mission. The sudden death of 7 astronauts, 5 men and 2 women, including the first teacher in space. Americans once again reaching for the stars, and this time, the first time, not making it. That is why the nation's flags are at half-staff tonight.
This is an ABC News special. The Shuttle, Disaster in Space. Reporting from Washington, here is Peter Jennings.
What we're going to try to do in the next hour is to put this national tragedy in some sort of context. The nation has lost 7 explorers. Ever since the manned space program began a quarter of a century ago with people like Alan Shepard and John Glenn, the astronauts, in one way or another, have seemed to belong to the nation. We do not know exactly what happened up there, 10 miles above Cape Canaveral this morning, but we will talk to other astronauts about what might have gone wrong. We certainly know what happened here on Earth. The shock and the sorrow has been truly international in scope. And so we'll talk, besides to just plain folks, to politicians, including Senator Jake Garn, who's been on the shuttle, and to James Michener, who so effectively captured the space program in his book. But we're going to begin with those who, to say it again, we have all lost. Here's ABC's Stone Phillips.
They were America's crew, men and women, veterans and first-timers, parents and even a classical pianist. They came from Akron and Detroit, Boston and the Carolinas. They were pilots and engineers and a teacher, and they were young. The oldest would have turned 47 in May. What they shared was a pioneer spirit, a passion for adventure, and a belief that man's discoveries in space can help solve problems on Earth. Their leader was Commander Dick Scobie, age 46, making his second journey into space. He became an astronaut in 1979 after 22 years in the Air Force. He saw combat duty in Vietnam, won the Flying Cross and Distinguished Air Medal, and later, as a test pilot, logged more than 5,300 hours in dozens of experimental aircraft. Born and raised in Washington State, Scobie is survived by his wife June and 2 children. A few months ago, he returned to his high school to share his enthusiasm for space.
He really wanted to interact with the kids. It was okay to talk to the adults, but his whole purpose of coming back was to deal with the kids and maybe give them some sort of a message or a goal.
Second in command was pilot Michael Smith, a 40-year-old commander in the U.S. Navy on his first shuttle mission. Like Scobie, he had served as a pilot in Vietnam, been decorated, and gone on to train as a test pilot. He was selected as an astronaut in 1980. He was married and the father of 3, and close to Senator and former astronaut Jake Garn.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident.
39-year-old Ellison Onizuka was Hawaii's first astronaut. His hometown honored him with a traditional parade before he left for astronaut training. Onizuka was also a husband and father, seen here with his 2 girls. Before turning astronaut, he taught at the elite Air Force Test Pilot School in California, and as chief of engineering there, was responsible for all instrumental and flight testing modifications on highly experimental jet aircraft. For Onizuka, a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, the exploration of space was a way to serve man's more immediate needs.
There are a lot of outcomes from these projects which will affect both our society and the rest of the world.
36-year-old Judy Resnick from Akron was on her second mission. Her specialty, electrical engineering, her assignment to operate the shuttle's mechanical arm. On her first mission, she used the device successfully to help remove ice from the outside of the orbiter. It was also on that mission in 1984 when the shuttle Discovery aborted takeoff moments after the engines had been fired. Resnick later expressed confidence in the shuttle's safety systems.
After it all happened, we were all very grateful that the safety features do what they're supposed to do on the orbiter, and I think that the system has been designed such that anything that could present a problem will be taken care of by these safety features.
When Resnick wasn't flying, she sometimes doubled as a commentator, helping bring to life for television viewers what it was like to take off on board the shuttle. Gregory Jarvis, age 41, was a Hughes aircraft engineer on board Challenger to conduct tests on the effect of weightlessness on liquids carried in tanks. NASA hoped his experiments would provide information for the design of liquid fuel rockets. He was born in Detroit and trained as an Air Force satellite engineer. He was married but had no children. Mission specialist Ronald Michener was doing research on lasers when he was selected to become an astronaut in 1978. Born in Lake City, South Carolina, schooled at MIT, he brought a background in physics to the shuttle program. This was his second flight. A husband and father, Michener saw space travel as a calling for himself and mankind.
So I see it as something that we must do, and I see it as something that's part of man's nature to explore.
And finally, the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, chosen from more than 11,000 applicants for what she described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Well, it was a challenge, and it was something that I always ask my students, you know, to go and seek whatever they feel they can do and reach a little higher.
McAuliffe taught social studies in Concord, New Hampshire, and she said she wanted to bring the wonder of space to students all across the country. She'd planned to give lessons on weightlessness and life in outer space that were to be televised to millions of schoolrooms. She's survived by her husband, her 2 children, and all the students she taught and adored in Concord.
She did this to get people into the space program, you know, to open up people's eyes and get people more enthusiastic about it. And I know that she will hope that people take this as a bad accident, as bad accidents to occur, and just to have faith.
In the end, faith is what America's space program began and grew up with, that and technology. Today, whatever it was that went wrong, it wasn't a problem of faith. Stone Phillips, ABC News.
The 7 men and women who flew on Challenger this morning, in some cases having flown before, and reminding us, of course, that the success of the space program has been such over the last few years. This was the 10th mission of Challenger and the 25th of the shuttle program, that we have come to take its success and its safety very much for granted until today. I suppose the reminder there is that we now identify with those men and women in a much more personal way than we have done almost at any point since the beginning of the space shuttle program, with the exception of a woman flying for the first time, or in the case of the first black astronaut in space. You saw in Stone Phillips' report Senator Jake Garn from Utah, who said that today's accident was so devastating to him it was clear. Senator Garn is now at Andrews Air Force Base, having just got off the Vice President's aircraft, having flown to Cape Canaveral to talk to the people at Launch Control and clearly to talk to the families. Senator Garn, I think I know what the mood and the atmosphere was that you found down there, but would you tell us anyway?
Well, obviously it was very difficult. You always feel so inadequate. What do you say to people when they have lost their loved ones, and particularly where I was so personally involved and knew those that were killed today? But I was so impressed with Mrs. Scobie. She stood up and she said, "We want you to know, Mr. Vice President and Senators, and I'm sure I speak for all of the families, that we want the space program to go on. We don't want this tragic accident to slow it down or stop it." And she said, "We know that our loved ones would feel the same way." And so just a very moving and touching experience.
Senator, you flew on the shuttle last April. You're an enormous supporter and very much a booster of the space program. What do you think today will do to America's program in space?
Well, obviously we can't fly again until we determine the cause of this tragic accident. But once that has been determined, we make certain that it can't happen again, then the space program should continue. We have learned so much from space. It benefits all of God's children, every place on this earth. The basic research and development that goes on is so valuable to us, and that must continue. And I think we need to look at the fact that we flew 56 manned space missions, a remarkable safety record, for this tragic accident today. So I hope that my colleagues will be smart enough to recognize the values of spaceflight, listen to Mrs. Scobie, and have the space program continue.
Senator, we have been thinking today about why this has been such a shock to the nation. Why do you think?
Probably because the space program has been so successful. John Glenn was with me today, and from his very first orbital flight, we have not lost a single American in space. And that is a remarkable record, and I suppose too many people have taken it for granted. They haven't realized that we are still in the infancy of space flight, that we still have a great deal further to go, just as in the beginning of general aviation after the Wright brothers. And so I guess they just expected never to have an accident. We just continue going on with our magnificent success record.
And Senator, there has been today the inevitable mini debate, I think we can say, about the value of man in space versus the value of sheer technology in space. Why should man go into space so constantly?
Why should man have explored the West? Why should the man have crossed oceans? There is a balance that we need in space. We have the Uranus mission out. We've done a lot of unmanned space programs. But you look at what man has been able to accomplish. You look at the work that has been done in space. You look at the experimentation on medicines for the future. You look at the repair, the retrieval of satellites in space. Man can do a great deal that machines can't do, and so you need a balance of the two. And we have had that, and that balance should continue, using robotics and using man.
Senator, I know this has been an extremely difficult day for you. I do have one last question. We were immensely frustrated waiting for NASA's briefing today and getting as little as we did. Do you think NASA will reach some kind of conclusion fairly quickly based on the data they have?
I would not expect a quick conclusion to this. There is so much information. There are hundreds of channels of telemetering data that comes back that has to be analyzed. They'll have to appoint a commission to study this. And I don't think they want any quick fixes. They want to know what happened and why and how to fix it. And that is the important thing, not speed in making that determination, to make sure we make a sound determination and sound recommendations.
Senator, you're very thoughtful to take the time for us when you've given so much time to the families today, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator Jake Garn, senator from Utah, who flew on the shuttle last April, and who, as we said, and as you can clearly see, is an enormous booster of the continuation of the American manned space program. The senator raises the question of safety and delay. Back in 1967, when the astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee died when their spacecraft caught fire on the ground, it took 22 months before the space program was resumed, which will give you some indication of how long we might now have to wait before the manned space program, the shuttle program, continues. Challenger today had flown for just a little over a minute. When it left Cape Canaveral after something of a delay, it was a little after 11:30 in the morning. Let us go back now to recall that moment which much of the nation saw live and much of the nation shared in, the initial joy and the subsequent horror.
Space shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control. Roger, roll, Challenger.
As you can see on your screens there, it was 11:39 in the morning Eastern Standard Time after yet another delay, and Challenger's had a number of them, as has had Columbia. But it looked so perfect against the blue Atlantic sky as the rollover came.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%.
And those big additional booster rockets in the main engine rocketed Challenger towards its orbit,
65% shortly.
roughly approaching 2,000 miles an hour.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells.
There will be a phrase here that we shall all long remember. Listen to mission control, tell them what to do.
257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up.
Go with throttle up. And then it happened.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And it occurred with such lightning speed as one of the booster rockets flies randomly off into space, and we look at it again in slow motion, that you may have noticed that the control commander, the launch control voice that we've become so familiar with on launches, was simply reading his telemetry, his information coming back, and was not aware, as so many people were when they saw it, even though they didn't understand it in space. Lynn Sherr, who covers space for us on a full-time basis. Lynn, can you pick up from your base in California and tell us now what we're seeing?
Well, Peter, we've just gotten past, obviously, the critical moment. This is the fireball. This is the catastrophic explosion engulfing the Challenger and the solid rockets. And I think in just a moment, you will see the what we think there on the lower right of your screen appears to be Challenger's nose emerging from that big cloud, then falling into the ocean, our last view of Challenger. We have examined these tapes so many times, Peter, that we think we can at least try to pinpoint the sequence. At the right of your screen now, the solid rocket booster fizzling off into nowhere. Nowhere to go. It is controlled before launch, and it's meant, of course, to be attached to the shuttle and to the tank and to take them into orbit. But with that premature explosion, it has nowhere to go, and it's off into the ocean. And if I'm not mistaken, the next few frames will show us the crazy spinning of the two solid rocket boosters forming kind of an awkward Y-shaped as they each go off in kind of a cockeyed direction, obviously not where they're meant to be going at all. It looked to us, when we have screened this tape before, that the first flame appeared in between the external tank and the orbiter. Now that's the plume on the left. That's a little bit of the gas fuel for the fire, just the liquid hydrogen and oxygen burning off. There is where we thought we saw the first sign of flame. Actually, I think it was a little bit before this. Maybe we can go back and find that. In any event, this is the flame that is now going to ride up the external tank in between the tank and the orbiter, both of them extremely thin-skinned on purpose for weight reasons. They're not meant to withstand this kind of explosion, and obviously when that liquid hydrogen and oxygen gets near that kind of heat, boom, it just went in an instant. And no one I have talked to here on Earth believes that it happened in any more time than just an instant. The astronauts, the shuttle, simply did not have a chance.
And in other words, to not put too fine a point on it, they didn't know it hit them.
Absolutely not. I know that you and everybody were talking very hopefully for a while that perhaps those parachutes indicated they had gotten out. There really does not appear to be any way. That shuttle is simply not designed for that kind of explosion. Now, of course, the problem is what really happened. We can look at the sequence. We can pinpoint where we see the flames. What NASA has to do is figure out why. Peter, we've been talking to a number of people. There are a number of theories, all of them speculation. Let me run down a few of them for you, if I may. One possibility, perhaps one of the three main engines simply let go, causing a problem that way. These engines had flown before, all three of them, one of them on 3 missions, one of them on 4 missions, the other on 4 missions. Perhaps something happened to an engine. Another possibility, perhaps there was a problem in the fuel line connecting the tank to the shuttle Challenger. Maybe something happened there. Another problem, perhaps it was one of the struts, one of the connectors holding that big tank onto the shuttle. Maybe that was the problem. Another possibility, a puncture in the tank. That tank, again, extremely thin-skinned, the orange tank. Maybe there was a hole, maybe there was a leak, who knows. The only other possibility, and I'm sure there are millions more, the only other possibility I've heard discussed was that one of those boosters, one of those white crayon-like structures on the side, those big Roman candles, perhaps went awry before it split off. Our evidence from the footage we've seen does not seem to indicate that. Again, we're not going to know until they do all the analysis.
Well, Lynn,
those are, again, just some of the theories.
Well, I'm just saying, just by suggesting some of the theories, you've opened an endless range of possibilities. One of the people who's been tremendously helpful to us today joins us again now from Houston, Gene Cernan, the former Apollo astronaut, the last man to walk on the moon. Gene, you've seen these same tapes over and over again today. What do they tell you?
Well, Peter, you know, we can speculate, I guess, all day long, but it does appear that something, Lynn's ideas are certainly have potential, but it appears to me that whatever it was, it violated the integrity of that tank and allowed the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen in some capacity to mix. And hydrogen is a tremendous explosive, and in this case we saw the results of what can happen when it's mixed with something like oxygen.
Well, Gene, let me offer, if I may, to you another theory, if I could get a look at this model here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but about a year ago the whole process was lightened up to some extent. And there was some suggestion today, at least by some people, that these struts, and Lynn has alluded to it, these things which basically hold the Challenger on to this enormous gas tank, which is really what it is, may have not been able to stand the stress. Do you buy that theory at all?
Well, of course, that's always possible, but you know, the vehicle was designed to go through that area we've talked so much about today called maximum dynamic pressure. That's when, if you will, the speed of the aircraft and the density of the air create the greatest wind on the spacecraft during its ascent. It's designed specifically as for that point being a high stress point, where you get the greatest shaking, the greatest bending of the skins, the greatest flapping of the wings, if you want to go to exaggeration. That's a very critical point. It appears that this either occurred just subsequent to that point. There may have been a rupture as a result of that through fatigue or for some other reason.
Gene, there has been the obvious question asked today about an escape mechanism in a space capsule or something on board the shuttle. There was one on Columbia some time ago. Why not on Challenger?
Well, you know, the Columbia's first 4 flights, I think the crew, it was only a 2-man crew. They did have ejection seats. It was a test vehicle. If we go into history of the space program, no other manned spacecraft has been flown for the first time with a man aboard. They were all flown unmanned until we got to the space shuttle. We built ejection seats in so that the crew was able to make some decisions at different points of the missions had they needed to, had they had some inkling of a problem that was forthcoming. We decided when we put 5 and 6 and 7 people on and the shuttle became more operational, proved its capability, its reliability, that not only was there no need for those ejection seats, in a case like this, for instance, they would not have even done any good. There was an escape mechanism, and that was a shuttle itself. If the crew, if the ground had some idea that there was a problem occurring, a critical problem, even a couple moments ahead of time, they could have jettisoned that external tank, jettisoned those solid rockets, and although the maneuver is very complicated and difficult, landed back at Kennedy Space Center.
Gene, I'd like to point out, and I know that you know this too, of course they had that capability. As you well know, nobody really ever wanted to try that. A return to the launch site abort, which is the technical name for it, that emergency landing back at the Cape, they say they were prepared for it. They didn't really ever want to try it. And just to add to what you were saying about the ejection seats, Peter, you're quite right. There were ejection seats on Columbia. There are no longer. It has been modified to match Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis. And as Gene points out, there were only 2 ejection seats, and now there's 5, 6, and 7 passengers.
Well, I think the point I'm trying to get at here, because it has been raised today, and let me get a fairly brief answer from you, if I may, Gene. Was this a shortcut because we were putting additional personnel on the shuttle, or is this a reflection of how good NASA felt about the safety of the program in general?
No, the program was designed to follow this this plan of attack. It was designed as a test article and a test vehicle initially to have those ejection seats. Subsequent to that, it was designed not to have them, and that was the plan. This was not a shortcut. It was just a planned and a long-term operation of this vehicle. You know, if I might refer to something Lynn said, she's absolutely right. Nobody ever wanted to make that abort and come back to landing site. A very difficult maneuver for the best aviator in the world. But we confronted those things a lot in the past. My last launch was a night launch. If everything failed and we had to abort during the same phase of the mission and we had to get off the launch vehicle, at nighttime I had to use stars to be able to orient the vehicle so that we could head in the right direction and not burn up coming into the atmosphere. That's something I didn't want to do, but it's something we practiced, and I think indeed I knew we could do it if we had to, and I believe that was the same in this particular case in every shuttle flight.
Gene, thank you very much for joining us. You've made a wonderful contribution today, and we're very grateful. It helped our understanding a lot. Gene Cernan, last man to set foot on the moon, one of the Apollo astronauts who has become, as we said at the beginning of this program, the nation's astronaut, one of those individuals who has been so touched. One of the things that people have said fairly regularly today is that we've become rather blasé about the success of the manned space program. On the other hand, people have tended to refer on more than one occasion to the way people chivied away at NASA because both Columbia and Challenger have spent additional time on the ground when they were supposed to be launched because of minor and sometimes not so minor problems. There's no question that both Columbia and Challenger's the issue here today, was something of a troubled spacecraft. Does not suggest by any means reflection on what happened today, but it was on occasion a troubled spacecraft. Here's John McWethy.
When they built this $1.5 billion spacecraft, they projected that it would be flying for at least a decade, part of a fleet of space shuttles that would be roaring into orbit every few weeks. Challenger was on its 10th flight today and just its 3rd year of service. Like its sister ships, Columbia, Discovery, and Atlantis, Challenger has suffered through some crippling technical problems over the years, but has also repeatedly written itself into the history books with its many successful firsts. It was aboard Challenger that Sally Ride, the first female astronaut, made her maiden voyage into space. Guyan Bluford became the first American black in space. His ship was Challenger. The spacecraft was used for the first space walk from a shuttle in 1983, and a year later it proved for the first time that shuttle could indeed capture a satellite, repair it, and send it back into orbit. But Challenger has also been shadowed by problems. Its first launch in 1983 was delayed for 2.5 months because of an engine leak. In one 1984 mission, the Challenger crew lost 3 satellites while trying to launch them into orbit. Malfunctions later blamed on the satellites, not on Challenger. In December of 1984, NASA had to scrub Challenger's next mission. It was supposed to carry the military's first secret payload into space. Challenger's protective heat shield had been badly damaged, and the ship had to go in for an extensive overhaul. Last July was probably Challenger's worst month until today. 3 seconds before its scheduled liftoff, the countdown was stopped because of a coolant leak.
We have an RSLS abort. We have an abort.
Later that same month, Challenger came perilously close to disaster when it suffered what NASA called a launch emergency. One of its engines shut down while the spacecraft was climbing into orbit. The crew scrambled to jettison excess weight, but they could never get Challenger up to its full orbit. Challenger was supposed to fly 5 missions this year. One of them was to be a secret military payload, taking it into orbit. The military, in fact, has been so concerned about the reliability of Challenger that it has insisted that NASA fly at least 2 military payloads a year the old-fashioned way atop expendable rockets. That was a hedge in case the Challenger and all of the other space shuttles proved that they could not do as promised. Peter?
John, thank you very much for joining us. In fact, on the 4 shuttles, there were 15 missions planned for 1986, both in the commercial field and the military field. This was to be a very ambitious year for the space shuttle. And as John McWethy points out, and as others have pointed out, this is an enormous setback, not only for the commercial competition, but also for the military program, which the United States had been using the shuttle for. In a sense, we'd like to put aside for a moment now the technical dilemmas for today of Challenger in this particular instance and the overall program, and talk about the human dimension, because as those of you all around the country must have felt, and we have been quite stunned, I must tell you, to hear and feel and sense the reaction from all around the world. It came from China, it came from the Soviet Union, Her Majesty the Queen in Britain, the National Parliament in Canada took a minute of silence. There was this quite incredible outpouring of sorrow and shock from around the world for the 7 individuals on board. To talk about them a little this evening, we've invited James Michener, the author, to come onto the program from Austin, Texas, because his book, to a great many Americans, captured the feeling and the sense of the people in the space program. Mr. Michener, thank you for joining us. Talk to us a little bit, if you would, about the people in the space program.
I received some criticism in my novel Space because the great effort that I focus on at the end ends in tragedy. It aborts on the moon, the 2 great heroes are left there, and one man is left with a sad job of bringing the ship back home. People said, why did you have to do that? Well, I had to do it because any man with common sense, looking at this great program, of which I had been a part for many years, knew that the capacity for what happened today was always there. It could always have happened. As a matter of fact, it did happen right at the beginning with those 3 wonderful young men, Grissom, White, and Chaffee. But the program went on. It was only 2 years after Chaffee and his friends died in that tragic accident that
the forces to which the crew were exposed during orbiter breakup were probably not sufficient to cause death or serious injury.
NASA now admits the astronauts may have lived through the Challenger explosion, only to die during the plunge to Earth. Good evening. I'm Charles Gibson, and this is Nightline. We'll talk tonight with former astronaut Gene Cernan about the latest dramatic development in the space shuttle investigation. And also tonight, the case of Father Lawrence Martinjenko. We'll talk with the Foreign Minister of Syria, which helped arrange the release, and with former Secretary of State Alexander Haig as we focus on the hostages still being held.
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Copeland, reporting from Washington, Charles Gibson.
It was 6 months ago today that the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up, 73 seconds after liftoff from Cape Canaveral. From that day to this, NASA has maintained the astronauts never knew what happened. Just a week ago, NASA said in a statement the crew was unaware of the events associated with the tragedy. Today, NASA admitted that may not have been the case. Electronic enhancement of crew tapes shows pilot Michael Smith said, uh-oh, just as the tape stopped. And NASA theorizes the crew may well have been conscious for 6 to 15 seconds after the explosion. Their findings were:
the forces to which the crew were exposed during orbiter breakup were probably not sufficient to cause death or serious injury, and that the crew possibly, but not certainly, lost consciousness in the seconds following orbiter breakup due to in-flight loss of crew module pressure.
Kerwin's words, the orbiter breakup probably did not cause death or serious injury, and the crew possibly, but not certainly, lost consciousness in the seconds following breakup. NASA acknowledges the astronauts were apparently alive long enough for some to activate their emergency air supplies, and much of that air was then consumed. In other words, even if unconscious, the astronauts could have been alive up to the time of impact, when their crew compartment hit the water. It is an emotional and a painful new element to what is known. With us to discuss it, former astronaut Gene Cernan. Gene, I think everybody 6 months ago on this day when they saw those pictures had a thought at some time during that day, oh my Lord, I hope they didn't know. Now apparently it seems they knew. Does that change anything in the grand scheme of things?
Well, you know, we're all, Charles, emotionally involved in that accident. I think all of us really wanted, once we knew the crew was lost, sort of wish maybe that they had just sort of stayed in space as it was with the explosion. But certainly it's possible anything could have happened, and they very well may have lived through that final fall. But, you know, the truth of the matter is they all gave their lives, and I think that's the bottom line that counts.
Gee, knowing what they apparently knew at the time, how would a test pilot, somebody who has been through astronaut training, how can you imagine they would react?
Well, you know, up until the moment an occurrence or a catastrophic failure occurs, you're with it. I mean, you're right there on top of it, so those words, "oh no," really don't surprise me, because when something happens, until it takes you out of the picture, so to speak, you're very much aware of it. And then you do everything you can, everything you've got within your control. I think survival instincts take over, whether you're flying an airplane, whether you have to get out of the airplane, or whatever it is that you have under your command to right the wrong, and in this case, right the wrong to the extent of being able to survive, is what you strive to do.
All right, NASA has just been able to reinterpret those tapes to figure out what the last words were, but they've had those emergency air packs for some time, and those had to be manually deployed. So NASA must have known, wouldn't they, that the astronauts took some action, i.e. manually deploying those air packs, after the orbiter breakup?
Well, you know, I still think most of it, although we can summarize from an accident, as we often do when we put accidents back together again, it's still pretty much all speculation. You know, they went through some very high G-forces for a short period of time. The cabin was tumbling as we could see it, I think, from the movies. The high rates of spin, the acceleration and deceleration could have activated the oxygen packs, could have caused a lot of things to happen. My personal feeling is that the crew may have somewhat realized that they were in a situation they couldn't control, but soon after that, I really think probably they may have lost consciousness and not really understood what happened.
Yeah, but this does raise the question, doesn't it, Gene, that NASA's known for some time that the astronauts could have taken some action after the breakup?
Well, I think maybe when you say they've known for some time, quite possibly they've known that maybe the crew had the opportunity to activate those packs, those oxygen packs, if that's what you're speaking of, Charles.
Yeah. Gene, one other thing. Doesn't this call into question the possibility of some sort of mechanism, I guess a large parachute or something, that could have brought the crew compartment down to the water safely? Is that possible? Could it have been possible if that had been on the shuttle?
Well, it's always going to raise a question of our capability to escape from a catastrophic failure we can't control. In this particular case, a simple parachute would not have done a job, because that cabin was not designed as an escape capsule. It's going to bring the question again, do we design such a system for the space shuttle in the future? And it may very well be that we do, but I think we must be aware that it's going to take several years and probably a major redesign of the space shuttle in order to accomplish that kind of escape capability. And there's a lot of people who, for that short period of time, and it's hard to say this when I say don't think it's worth it when we sit here and haven't lost 7 lives, but some people realize or believe that the risk is going to be worth the major redesigns that might be required.
And that kind of a major redesign, you're saying, would take so long as to virtually kill the program?
Well, I think the momentum in this country is such, and the constituency of the American public is such, it will be in space for a long time in the future. But certainly would slow down the shuttle program and put us way behind where we might like to be, and might have us rethink where we're going with the shuttle, and maybe even skip it and go on to another vehicle. That indeed would take us a long time.
All right, Gene Cernan, thanks for being with us very much.
My pleasure, thank you.
When we come back, we're going to turn to our other topic.